Hello, everybody. Thank you very much to the Concilium Scientifique for this invitation. My presentation will be a bit about conflict of interest, and more precisely, I would try to present a genealogy of this social category. As you know, conflict of interest has, over the last few decades, gained importance in the medical world, both in the way its organization operate and in the controversies inside the field. It is extensively used by a large kind of people, groups involved in denouncing health scandals, scientists challenging the promotion of certain therapeutic option, and our journalists investigating public decision. This category is also institutionalized in many procedures, many scientific organizations like universities, research centers, academic journals, regulatory agencies, and so on. There are procedures asking people to declare their interest. Why trying to trace a genealogy of conflict of interest? Because social categories are not neutral, and it affects the way people see the world, the production of information, the moral vision of the field, but also political mobilization. So it is interesting to understand why this specific category has become prominent. And this presentation is based on a research project which is called MEDICI, and which was financed by the French National Research Agency. And there is a forthcoming book on the result of this research project, which will be published in September. Just a quick information. I will mainly talk about biomedical research and regulatory authorities in this presentation. So I will try to distinguish four main phases in this genealogy of conflict of interest, and I will underline the fact that the category has served to discuss many different problems in this different period. As you know, the dominant definition of conflict of interest point to situation that create a risk that a professional judgment or professional decision, for example, concerning the treatment of a patient, or concerning a public decision, or an evaluation of a drug, for example, will be unduly influenced by a secondary interest. And most of the time, this secondary interest is a financial link or a financial benefit. Of course, the underlying principle or moral dilemmas behind the conflict of interest notion are not new. We can trace its roots to the concept of fiducia in Roman law, for example, and more specifically, we can talk about the notion of ambidextery in the Middle Ages. Lawyers were forbidden to receive money from both parts during a case, or to conflict, to share confidential information to the other part of a case. In the realm of politics, there were provisions banning certain politicians to participate in decisions that would affect their own situation, of course. One example is the offices of profit in the British Parliament, starting from the 16th century. However, if we can trace a few examples of the use of the conflict of interest category in its current meaning before the 50s, it is mostly from the 50s that this category emerged in the public debate. And it was at that time what we could call a catch-all category that was used to designate 7 different law status that were dealing with the relationship between public officials and private entities, for example, in terms of shareholding or revolving door, and this group of laws became controversial. Why? Interestingly, there were 2 different dynamic and in a way contradictory dynamic. The first one was a kind of public distrust of the relationship between some politician and private entities, and controversies about their own interest. This was strong, important during the Truman and Eisenhower administration, and there were several important officials of Eisenhower administration that were targeted for that issue. Most of the time, in relation to what was called the military-industrial complex. And one example of that, and according to commentators at the time, the controversy that surrounds the nomination of General Motors CEO Charles Erwin Wilson as a Secretary of Defense in 1953 was really a central moment, or a turning point in the history of conflict of interest. In fact, while he ultimately gave in, Wilson refused to sell his large volume of General Motors shares, despite the company being the leading Department of Defense supplier. And he finally accepted to do it, but this was in a way too late. And this idea of the conflict of interest was at the center of the public debate. So this first dynamic was that we need to reinforce conflict of interest law. The second dynamic was quite the contrary. There was an idea at that time that the state had a growing need for expertise and consultants from scientists, but most of the time also from the law professional, and the conflict of interest status were not appropriate to regulate this specific form of participation to the administration, because they had been defined for full-time employee. And so there was that idea that we need to soften the law to facilitate the work of expertise inside the government and the circulation of professionals from the public domain to the private one. And for example, the first use of conflict of interest in its current meaning in the New York Times was about the Nimitz Commission. It was a commission which had been put in place by President Truman and to investigate government loyalty and the government employee loyalty. There was this fear about communist espionage activities inside the government. And the Senate, the US Senate, refused to grant exception from this conflict of interest rules to some of its members, mostly military veterans and lawyers. So the commission decided to disband and to end its investigation. And so this was a symbolic moment for all those, and for example, lawyers who were advocating for a new regulation as concerns conflict of interest. And an important actor in this history is the New York City Bar Association, who decided to create a committee on conflict of interest laws in 1955. And its report has been really influential on the future decision. In fact, at that time, and in late 1960, President Kennedy was elected after making promises of integrity, but also of enlightened modernity, and with advice from the main actor of this main writer of this report, Professor Manning. He decided to implement a new regulation on conflict of interest, and it was the Bribery, Graft, and Conflict of Interest Act. It was interesting because this act did not define conflict of interest. He specified and expanded in a way the kind of financial interest that should ban somebody from participating in public decision making. But most of all, he created a new status, the special government employee, for people who were only employed by the government part-time or temporarily. And for these people, he decided to create a system of waiver, and so people who would be able to participate in the decision in spite of their conflict of interest, as long as they had declared this interest to a superior who had judged that the interest is not so substantial as to be deemed likely to affect the integrity of the services. So this is really the creation of the whole idea that we are now living in. During the 70s, there was the rise of a social movement trying to protect the interest and the consumer and the environment. And this context and the adoption in 72 of the FACA that was adopted to define a legal framework to create and for the functioning of the federal advisory committees, and the FACA incorporated the 62 law. There was this FACA adoption, and also there was growing controversies about the fact that several several federal agencies like the FDA or the EPA had not really implemented the 62 law on conflict of interest. And by extension, there were also a lot of controversies around the conflict of interest of members of national academies of science expert committees. And during that period, there was several Congress investigation on this issue. And for example, in 1976, it was discovered in an internal investigation inside the FDA that more than 150 FDA employees were in violation of the 62 law. And so at that time, the FDA, for example, began to really adopt formal rules to regulate conflict of interest. But this idea, the prevailing idea at that time was still that conflict of interest were only to be managed, not to be banned. And there was this quite famous report on the FDA at that period, and why the report said that there were trends in the FDA that privileged cooperation and good relationship between firms and the regulators. There were no way to escape totally to a conflict of interest. And I quote a sentence of this report saying that, yes, it's impossible to have a candidate in the committee that will be totally free of a conflict of interest. So the idea was still that we just need transparency. So during this first period, conflict of interest was mostly discussed within administrative and political sphere. It really entered in the medical science during the 80s. Why? Well, we can define and isolate two broad dynamic also that articulated. First, there were a federal regulation adopted at that time, adopted to straighten the connection between academics and industry firms, the most famous being the Bayh-Dole Act of 1980. And this new possibility to allow universities and the research center to patent discoveries they had made using federal funds and to exploit this patent with industrial partners represented at that time an opportunity for universities to redefine their financial structure, but also for scientists to make profit from their scientific work. And for example, at Harvard, there was an idea to create its own company. Harvard University wanted to create its own company to market the work of its DNA researcher and financed by venture capital. And this evolution was met with strong criticism in the press. There was suggestion, for example, that Harvard changed the veritas of its motto into cupiditas, but also public discussion and strong criticism from a professor at Harvard or scientists in general. And all began to use conflict of interest as a way to designate the issue, because it was an obvious way to designate the contradiction between a public aim, like the government one, but as for science, to make an advancement, to help the advancement of knowledge, and a private interest, as was incarnated by this new scientific entrepreneurship. And the second dynamic is a series of scandal scandal about several scientific fraud in 1980, and all these fraud were connected in a way to the biomedical field, so the Congress decided to organize some hearings about misconduct in science, and these hearings started in 91, but all through the rest of the decade, there was some hearings on this issue in the Congress. And what is interesting for our subject is that during this hearing, and from the very beginning of this hearing, a causal link was drawn between this case of fraud and the funding of research. And this was not obvious to draw this line. As a consequence, to protect their autonomy, because the government was threatening them to intervene in their working and in their funding and so on, universities and medical journals alike imported, in a way, a conflict of interest procedure that had been defined in the political field to their organization. And the first example of that, it is Harvard University, who was at that time at the center of controversy, who decided to implement what was presented at that time as the first procedure of this kind in the country, and to adopt guidelines on conflict of interest. And Harvard professors were asked to declare any conflict of interest or any work that seem likely to present an unacceptable conflict of interest to a special committee, a special faculty committee. And the same evolution occurred as concerned medical journal. And the most famous of medical journal, the New England Journal of Medicine, decided to import Harvard a new procedure in a way, because its editorial directly designate that these new procedures in the universities. And in a quite famous editorial, its editor-in-chief decided that the authors of the article should declare their what could be considered to be a conflict of interest. But it should be noted that this conflict of interest procedure was really focused on this new scientific entrepreneurship, not on the existing and old relationship between clinician, researcher, and the pharmaceutical industry. It was really this idea that there was a new ethos, a new way of doing research. Okay, and as a consequence, the procedure in the New England Journal of Medicine mostly pointed to very strong and direct financial ties, as patent, shares, consultancy position at the time of the working of the submission of the article. So there was no time period like nowadays, 5 years or 4 years or 3 years. Okay, there was it was only a conflict of interest at the time of the submission, and it was a purely a voluntary declaration, and the idea was that it was not supposed to interfere at all with the peer review process. Unfortunately, after this first wave of formalization, there was a new series of scandals around conflict of interest in the US. For example, it was revealed that several researchers had conducted clinical trials using National Institute of Health financing for a heart treatment developed by the biotech firm Genentech, while holding shares of the same company, and some had even purchased some shares just before the result of their clinical trials were published. So, as a response, there was at that time a new round of congressional hearings, and I put here a few names of this hearing, and as you can see, federal response to misconduct in science are conflict of interest hazardous to our health. There is this direct link made between the whole range of misconduct to this problematic influence of pharmaceutical firms, or of not really pharmaceutical firms of that time, but of entrepreneurship, scientific entrepreneurship. Okay. As a response to the controversy about NIH funding, the NIH tried to develop its own guideline on conflict of interest, and it was quite ambitious. One of the directors of the NIH said at that time, what we are basically saying is, let's get rid of any conflict of interest. But this guideline was presented as a threat to the United States biomedical research, and it was abandoned. It is worth noting that there was a really weak enforcement of conflict of interest regulation at that time, in universities and medical journals alike. And also, it is worth noting that British journals like The Lancet, the BMJ, or Nature, they remain totally outside this debate, and with no discussion about that, no procedure around this issue at that time. The third phase began in the 90s. There was an expansion of conflict of interest to cover new grounds, both in the term of the behaviors it included and in terms of its geographical spread. First, I will be quick on that point. There was a diffusion of conflict of interest regulation in Europe and in European drug agencies. In fact, in the context marked by European integration, there was an important discussion on what was called the rise of the regulatory state. It was conceived as in opposition of the more traditional European interventionist state. And there was that idea that now what was of most importance was not the result in a way, but what they called the procedural legitimacy, meaning that the public decision must be made in transparent ways, and so on and so on. In this context, there was a lot of new agencies created in Europe, and for example, the European Medicine Agency, which was created in '93, and these new drug agencies aimed at importing what was seen at that time as FDA best practices as concerned transparency, and most notably as concerned the mere existence of a conflict of interest procedures. This geographic expansion went hand in hand with a more general redefinition of the category primary targets. As we have seen in the 80s, biotech entrepreneurs were seen as the main source of conflict of interest because they mixed scientific objectives and with capitalistic growth strategies. And so it was only by extension, in a way, that researchers who own shares in some companies were targeted. But during the 90s, there were important changes in the sector. As we know, there was a rapidly rising share of private funding of biomedical research, with only 32% of research funding in the US to 62% in the 90s to 62% at the beginning of 2000. So it was a really quick change of the share of the private funding. And at that time, there were also the first scientific publication demonstrating statistically a corporate bias in medical research, meaning that depending on the funding and depending on the conflict of interest of authors, we can statistically measure a bias in the result, meaning that this publication would be more in favor of the drug being investigated. And third, there were several accounts of the new power relationship between pharmaceutical firms and researchers. And there was several of them, but I quote here one about Dr. Betty Zhang, a pharmacologist at a public university, and it was revealed that the pharmaceutical company had, by threatening its her university of a lawsuit, been able to prevent her to publish an article in the JAMA and on thyroid treatment, and the company, moreover, had commissioned another article published, which had been published using the same data, her data, and to reach opposite conclusion. So at that time, there was really that the pharmaceutical firms' influence was really beginning to bias scientific knowledge. So the threat that industry influence pose to journals' credibility as a gatekeeper, in a way, of knowledge production transform conflict of interest from a fringe issue into one of medical publishing sector's primary concern. And there was a growing institutionalization of conflict of interest regulation the International Committee of Medical Journal Editors mentioned only first conflict of interest the first time in 88, made a first joint declaration on conflict of interest in 93, but it was really it was not really implemented, with weak knowledge, weak very few declarations from scientists who were not used to think about their own conflict of interest. And in 2001, this organization decided to really straighten the regulation of conflict of interest of articles, and he published a new declaration with very strong words, saying that any article that will not comply by their new regulation will not be published in their journal. And so there was really this beginning of real policies, not only formal policies written somewhere in the paper news in the journal, but really the will to implement these policies and to make authors declare their interest. And one good example of this evolution is the British medical journal, The Lancet, who said at the beginning of the 90s and all during the decade, it was one of the journals which was more skeptical about the reality of the problem or about the solution to this problem. It was quite suspicious in a way. And there was this editorial from his editor-in-chief, conflict of interest in clinical research, opprobrium or obsession. And so the Lancet policy was quite weak, so just asking authors to declare any issue that might be embarrassing should they come to light. And at the end, at the beginning of the next decade, really their stance evolved, and there was an editorial about the tightening grip of big pharma. And finally, the journal required that all authors sign COI declaration in 2002. So you can see that really an evolution of the journal, acknowledging that it's not only a political correctness, and this is a real problem of concerning the credibility of scientific knowledge. Last sequence, starting in the mid-2000, there was a new problematization of conflict of interest. It really shift of visibility. It was mostly before then professional problems in the biomedical sector, and it became really much more debated inside in the public debate. Why? Well, probably we should point to several health controversies and scandals. The first of them, the Vioxx. And the Vioxx scandals happened in the wake of other ones, like cerevastatin in 2001, hormone replacement therapy in 2002, and of course the same year, the antidepressant off-label use in children and adolescents, which was very, very mediatic. And in the wake of these controversies, there was a lot of political, journalistic, legal, and professional investigation into the conflict of interest issue. And they point not only to regulatory agencies, experts, but also to doctors, medical journals, like everybody in the medical domain was thought as a target of conflict of interest strategies. And the really what changed at that time is that conflict of interest was seen as not only a problem from the production of evidence, but also as something creating health hazard. And it was really the difference, because it produced a scandalization of conflict of interest. And of course, scandals and scandalization are something like that has a huge impact on media and as a consequence on the political sphere. And conflict of interest denunciation became a new common thread in all health controversies. And we could see last year during the ongoing COVID-19 pandemic, as conflict of interest can be used to fight against arguments, and how this issue is always raised when there is a controversy. As a consequence, that denouncing missing or inaccurate conflict of interest declaration became a very effective action repertoire. And we can show that there are a lot of examples of that. One in the first chapter of the book, I explain how, for example, the adoption of the Sunshine Act in the USA is also the result of a denunciation of a very influential psychiatric researcher, and we can talk about in France the Formandep, who has mobilized against some public recommendation about the treatment of diabetes and Alzheimer's diseases, and how they use this tool, this weapon of pointing to missing declaration of interest to make this recommendation be erased from the legal domain. And there was EMEA also, the European Medicine Agency was also attacked about that problem, that COI issue several times. And of course, in the oncology sector, there was that famous Baselga scandal about this world-renowned cancer researcher who had failed to disclose millions of dollars in payment from drug and healthcare companies in dozens of research articles, and he was later forced to step down from his position as a chief medical officer of the Memorial Sloan Kettering Cancer Center. This politicization and politicization of conflict of interest led to a new round of formalization. And I will be quick on that because I'm already at the end of the time. But the FDA and the EMEA adopted a new regulation. Medical journals also reinforced a lot their procedure and adopted a common standard to help authors to avoid any mistake. And now the purposeful failure to disclose a conflict of interest is considered to be the fourth type of scientific misconduct. And there was also this expansion of conflict of interest to physicians, but also in France, nurse and so on. So more and more groups of health professionals are forced to declare their interest. One consequences of that is that the false, incomplete, missing declaration has become the primary target of professional media attention more than the mere existence of the relationship itself, you know. And well, this is an interesting evolution because we do not discuss anymore we discuss less the existence of a financial relationship than the bad declaration of this relationship. A few words of conclusion. So I try to show that there was common characteristics in every context that help to propagate the category of conflict of interest, with new and familiar practices developing within different social spaces, and the ability of this category to flag and denounce practices, but without changing much in the sector, without evoking well legally defined categories like fraud or corruption, but without challenging these new practices. And this had some paradoxical effect. In a way, it has made the problem that it was meant to solve more visible, because of the procedure you can calculate, you can produce data on conflict of interest, and so the problem is now more objective. And the second paradoxical consequence is the more you formalize something, the more there can be some failure to declare, some failure to abide by this procedure, and of course there is more and more scandal in a way. The second conclusion I want to draw is I've tried to demonstrate that there is an evolution of the social issues at stake. First, it was mostly governmental problem. Then it was taken up in scientific circle because of something specific. I mean, scientific entrepreneurship. Then it widened in the 90s because of big pharma growing influence as concerned knowledge production. And so there was that idea that knowledge is biased. And last evolution, it was seen mostly as it was connected to public health risk following several scandals like Vioxx. Okay, so at the conclusion of this conclusion, I would like to point that this category, of course, has many limits. It has a very individualistic conception of corporate influence. It is mostly an apparatus of security, to use Foucault word, meaning that it does not ban things. It creates a new environment where people have to decide what they do and not decide and not to do. But it is something that we could call an organizing concept, because it has consequences on knowledge, on moral, on politics. So it plays a central role now in all questions about industry influence, and more widely the debate about the role of drugs in medical care. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Boris. If you could turn your cameras back on.
Yeah, right. I did that already, no?
Excellent. So yes, we see everyone. So who wants to go first with the questions? I have a bit of feedback. It seems like with conflict of interest, we all became aware of that. Whenever you join any employment place, you submit your article, you do need to fill out the forms. But it became almost like this agree button when you install new software, which means little. And the system just learned to exist within this new format.
Yeah.
with very few consequences. I think the Selge case, once again, is an amazing example of it. From one illustrious career, you simply go to another illustrious career, and punishments are not there. It's outrageous that there, but it comes and goes, kind of. It's very much on the background. And I guess my question to you is, we learned to live with it, and I guess became very accepting of it. Is there anything you think society should do? Should that be an offense for which you pay in some way, or is there any way to actually tackle it that it can diminish it?
Oh, I'm just a sociologist, so my work normally is not to change things, but I can say what I feel. I'm more like a citizen than a researcher, but I think that the main problem is that we do not split enough the issue. And there is some normal, we'll say, inevitable, given the current system relationship between researcher and firms, for example, because if you want to be a clinician, you have to be linked in a way with people producing new drugs. But that does not mean that you have to be consultant for them, or you have to sit in a committee inside the firm. So I think the problem of conflict of interest is that it mixes, very different kind of relationship. Some are inevitable, and so that's it. If we don't change our society, we have to accept them. But some are evitable. Some are a real choice, and you can ban, for example, that you can forbid from public servant to accept consultant position. I think it could be acceptable, maybe, or to be directly part of some committee inside the firm. It's not something that you have to do your research. It's not, you can do your research without being so close to firms. So it's not my role to decide on that. But I think that the good way is to separate different kind of link, and to deal with them differently, and not to bring all, because if you bring all kind of link in the same packet, the only solution is to only go with transparency, because you can't forbid researcher to have some link with the firm. So if you put all the links in the same box, you have to do only transparency. If you want to do something else, you have to separate the situation, the kind of links.
Thank you, Boris. So we have two questions. Francois, you were first, and then Ian rose the hand. So Francois, if you still have a question, go ahead. If not, I'll pass it to Ian.
Yes, Boris, it was a very interesting presentation. Boris, I wanted to ask you, talking about the regulatory authorities for the regulation of medicines, beyond the individual conflict of interest, I believe that there are some structural conflict of interest. First of all, for the MEA with the European Parliament, because the MEA is primarily regulated by the European Parliament, and you know that the European Parliament, within the European Parliament, there are very strong lobbies of the pharmaceutical industry, which can influence, or which every day try to influence, in fact, the policies of the EMA, but also the fact that the EMA itself is primarily financed by the income from pharmaceutical industry. I think 90 or 95% of the budget of the agency of the EMA is coming from the fees from the industry. So financially, the EMA does not have an incentive to make negative decisions on medicines, because it will immediately lose some money. So my question is, do you believe that beyond the individual conflict of interest, we should go beyond and try to tackle the structural conflict of interest?
Thank you very much for this fantastic question. I would say there is a channel of influence of the pharmaceutical industry that go through lobbying, we'll say, okay? So, or, which is, will work on the procedure, on the law, on the governing the activity of the EMEA, of the EMA. And so I think it's quite evident, and we have seen that during the last decade there have been quite important evolution in the accelerated procedures and so on, and conditional procedure, which also are very important in the oncology domain. And like with all the biomarkers and so on. So this all framework of acting of the EMEA is of course highly influenced by interest group. I'm not sure that we need the conflict of interest as a concept to think about that, because it's more like the political struggle in Brussels, and of course there is some opponent to this lobbying activity of the firms, but they are so much weaker that of course firms tend to win a lot of time. And there is a day-to-day functioning of the agency, and I don't think that the parliament is intervening so much on the day-to-day working of the agency, because he has not the capacity to do so. Well, so that would be my point, that of course there is a very strong influence on the political side, but I would not think that there is a strong influence on the day-to-day decision. Concerning your last point, of course, this is an issue, and all the problematic also of the scientific advice that the pharmaceutical firms are paying to the agency, like it's kind of service, that you are buying. And I remember when I did my research a long time ago inside the agency, that they were quite ill at ease with this scientific advice, because they were saying that, okay, they need the money, so it's good money, but that they were creating a kind of dependency. And I think this is one of the problematic aspects of this private financing, because for the approval, would say that it's kind of mandatory. You have to pay it. But on the scientific advice, it's much complicated, because you can decide to pay more in a way, the agency, and it creates a kind of clientelist situation. So this is much more problematic from my point of view.
Thank you. Ian.
Yeah, thank you. I enjoyed your presentation, Boris. Mine's are more comments. I may be the only one of you who's actually been involved with chairing trials that have gone through drug registration and so on. There's a recent paper by my colleague Chris Booth and his people. It's industry. So we can't, if you're an oncologist and you want to be involved with drug development, you have to work with industry, and I have done that. I do think that bringing the problem out in the open is an advantage. At least we can see, not everybody, of course, is honestly reporting, but at least the Sunshine Act and so on tells you a bit about that. But I think the problem for my colleagues, and incidentally, I have never taken personal money from companies. I obviously had funding to do the trials. And I think there are some institutions which have now required that their staff do not accept personal funds from companies. And I think this should grow. Mm-hmm. I think the problem among us oncologists and trialists and so on is that we haven't yet got to a situation where it's looked down upon to take money from companies, and particularly in the West, where physicians are well paid, that this should be, if you like, I mean, I hate to say this with David puffing on his pipe, but we need to get it rather like what we think of smoking, that this is something that is to be, is highly undesirable, and that we should be setting examples of doing that. You know, going through some of the abstracts at ESMO and ASCO, sometimes the list of conflict of interest that people write there is as long as the abstract itself. It's absolutely ridiculous. And there's data that about 80% of, 70% of oncologists take money from companies, so it's absolutely widespread. And I think there needs to grow a movement to shame these people for doing that. And until that happens, we're still going to see a lot of cash passing hands. I do think it has some impact. Obviously, the companies do it for a reason. I think we've escaped some of the, the more blatant conflicts that have led to inappropriate prescribing and registration that you described in your talk earlier, such as the Vioxx and other things like that. But it's still, the companies, as an editorial that I wrote recently, they're purchasing the silence of trialists to not object to, well, in particular, the obscene prices that funds are, that the companies are charging for their drugs. But I think there are organizations that are trying to make this a shameful thing to be doing. Not that they shouldn't work with companies. If you don't work with companies at the moment, we won't get new drugs. You could argue that's not the best way of developing drugs, but it's what we have. But on the other hand, I think that you can work with companies but still maintain your independence, and some people do that. And we need to push more and more people to act in that way, in my opinion. But it was very interesting, how these things have evolved.
Thank you. Thanks a lot for your comment.
Ian, you made some really good points there, and as an extension of that, I mean, having worked on the journal for a few years, we requested in the end that all authors who submitted their papers at the submission stage, we actually made it a requirement for the authors to have their competing interests before the article could even get sort of pushed through the system to the first point where the editors look at the paper and decide if they want to take it or not. And actually it was done for that reason, and not at the acceptance stage after peer review, because if there was a conflict, it's almost a bit too late to then have it revealed later in the process, if you see what I mean. And actually, by both signing a print version of the competing interest form and by also having to get these statements on the online bit, once in a blue moon, it didn't happen too often, but we occasionally did detect discrepancies. I'd like to think with a benefit of the doubt head on my shoulders that that was probably done as an oversight, or it was not an intentional thing. But occasionally we did discover people who hadn't declared something when they in fact should have done. But the points really as well that you've made, so I haven't really got a question, I'm just a bit like Ian, I'm sort of musing here, is that the first thing is journals have got this strict and rightly so request that we have openness and transparency and conflict of interest, and yet journals aren't really doing the very same thing that they practice, or they practice what they preach. So for example, we see many print journals with display advertising for drug companies,
of course.
And we get lots of reprint revenues in the hundreds of thousands. I'm sure New England and Lancet have benefited many millions over the years from a particular drug trial, and yet none of that information is disclosed. So I would like to think that if journals are insisting authors disclose their COIs, well, it could work both ways, and perhaps revenue streams should be a little bit more transparent. But it's also interesting that you pointed out that the paradox, because obviously a lot of these changes that happened were all motivated in the end, sadly, through scandals. Rather than it happening of its own accord, it took some big discord to occur for then the change to happen. And actually, the other thing that occurred to me is you could get the flip side, where you might have a situation where a speaker or an author of a paper might actually be trying to slightly discredit an opposition or competing either drug or even hypothesis, which might indirectly be favouring them financially later down the line, which is a sort of indirect conflict of interest. And yet I don't see an awful lot of where people are necessarily looking into that angle. So that's just maybe something to kind of, bear in mind, as it were, because I think that there's a potential for that to happen. And I think the other thing is that John Hickman remembers this. I think it was Tito Foho in our talk 2 years ago in our conference in 2019, going back to the point, Ian, that you said that the list of competing interests is as long as the abstracting a lot of these medical conferences like ASCO and ESMO. And sure enough, if you look at the second slide of the speakers at some of these meetings, they've got 11, 12 bullet points, and they put the slide on the screen for all of 5 seconds. You can't even get to the end of the first bullet. And it's almost like, okay, I've done the conflicts, finished, next slide. So there's a sense that transparency, just the sheer act of showing something or displaying it, is enough. And actually, it's not necessarily enough. I think we need maybe a greater push on the implications. And Ian did a great talk a few months ago about the checklist idea that he had with, if the sort of primary endpoints of a study are not met, and actually only the secondary endpoints are met, and yet the spin of the article is still done to sort of promote the positives rather than, and slightly brush under the carpet maybe some of the negatives, irrespective of p-values. Maybe there should be something more along those lines, even with competing interests. Maybe there should be something that almost does a flag or a sort of, alert system when you've got something where there's a clear industry tie. So at least readers are not just seeing a competing interest statement that's buried on the 27th page at the very end in very small little letters beneath the references that nobody sees very much and tends to look at. I don't know what you think about those suggestions, but.
I want to respond to all, but just a few comments. On the first point you made, I interviewed for another paper where I made on the specifically on the policies of the medical journal. I interviewed a lot of editors of the big like JAMA, New England, and Lancet, BMG, and so on. So of course I asked them about what do you do with your advertising in your journal, and how do you deal with that, with the contradiction. And of course, and as I remember it, most of them responded that it was interesting from at least a sociological point of view. They responded that this money helps them to have permanent staff. And this permanent staff, was a way to have, to have a real evaluation of the article. So it's the kind of independence produced by professional reviewing. And so it was a way to differentiate with all the rest, of scientific journal who have not permanent staff or weak permanent staff. And like it was like our excellence allow us to see where there is bias or not in an article, owing to this financing in a way. So it was kind of well, okay. And as in your last point, I think, or before your last point, on the fact that when you give too much information, it's not an information anymore. Of course, there is the policy of the New England, doing a very long declaration is a way to kill the tool in a way. And of course, some other journals prefer to make some summary. I think it's probably more efficient, because you, as an editor, you select what you consider to be relevant, for you, and some people can read it. Nobody will read a 100 pages formula from So it's a kind of killing of the tool, and some have I think have measured the number of seconds, in the conferences when the declaration of interest are made, and of course it's too fast to have a human reading of the information. So So of course, it's not really an information neither, you know, it's just a way to do it. And
Yeah.
most of the time, not all the time, of course, but most of the time.
Thank you very much, Boris.